thank you everyone for joining us. Happy Monday, everyone. My name is Nicholas. I'll be walking you guys through the conversation today. So let's get started. The rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine is continuing. Here in New York last Monday, the list of those eligible to get vaccinated grew. That list now includes people with underlying conditions like type 1 diabetes and other comorbidities. Now, as of Friday last week, the state had administered just short of 2,400,000 doses of the vaccine. People are continuing to get tested at local pharmacies and state-run facilities like the Javits Center. But as the number of people being vaccinated rises, it's now more important than ever to have emphatic conversations with friends, relatives, and others in our community who may be hesitant or who may have concerns about the vaccine. We're looking to address some of those concerns and questions in our second public health conversation, our first one being last week. Some of what we're hoping to touch on today are some of the psychological factors that can promote and ultimately undermine people's confidence in the vaccine. Added to that, we'll also look at some of the misinformation out there surrounding the vaccine. Our panel of medical professionals will address your concerns, but we'll also provide you with the tools and strategies to help you educate others on the importance of getting vaccinated. We'll also help you understand what arguments you might come across. Now, this is being recorded and will be available at the same URL immediately following our conversation. You can be part of the conversation by submitting your questions in the chat, and we'll make sure to do our best to get those to the panel as they come up. Well, first, I'd like to start by introducing our panel. Dr. David Scales is a hospitalist and sociologist at Weill Cornell Medical College down there in the city. His research focuses on medical communication and misinformation. He's also the chief medical officer at Critica, an NGO studying the best ways to combat scientific and medical misinformation online. Additionally, Dr. Scales is the co-founder of Health for Palestine, a community health care worker program for Palestinian refugees. Dr. Scales serves on the board of QuestScope, another NGO focused on education and mentorship for vulnerable populations in Syria and Jordan. Dr. Scales has a PhD in sociology and an MD from Yale University. And also joining us is Dr. Gorman and his daughter Sarah are co-founders of Critica Inc., a nonprofit corporation. Dr. Gorman serves as Critica's president. Now, Critica is devoted to fighting science denial and promoting the acceptance of science and health and safety decision-making. Dr. Gorman also founded Franklin Behavioral Healthcare Consultants in 2010. He serves as CEO and Chief Scientific Officer there. Now, Franklin Behavioral Healthcare Consultants provides expert guidance to biotech companies and to healthcare worker organizations in order to improve the efficacy and cost effectiveness of mental health care. Dr. Gorman graduated summa cum laude from the University of Pennsylvania and received his medical degree from the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Columbia University. Dr. Gorman did his residency and fellowship training in the Department of Psychiatry of Columbia University, New York State Psychiatric Institute program. Dr. Gorman authored or co-authored more than 400 scientific articles and chapters and was continuously funded by the National Institute of Health for his research from 1981 to 2006. He won numerous awards for his research and service of psychiatry from organizations like the American Psychiatric Association, American College of Neuropsychopharmacology, and Society for Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, and is one of the most frequently cited authors in the psychiatry and neuroscience literature. And I believe you actually have a couple books behind you there, Dr. Gorman. So let's get right to it. So my first question, I'll just send it over to Dave. Now, Dave, what information or what is some of the misinformation out there, and why is it so dangerous as far as the vaccine goes? So send it over to you, Dr. Scales.
Sure. Well, thanks, Nick. Thanks for that kind introduction. It's very happy to be here talking about this and talking about misinformation in the vaccine context and what are some ways that people can help create a better information climate for people that are hearing a lot about misinformation. Misinformation is, in short, false information that's being spread. You know, there's a lot of words that people might hear to describe this. Sometimes disinformation is used. Disinformation is essentially the spreading of false content, false information, but intentionally spreading it. A lot of misinformation is being spread out there, but people don't know that they're spreading misinformation. For example, they might just, they see an article that's raising a concern about the vaccine, without knowing that the concern has already been addressed and studied, and there really isn't that much of a concern out there from the perspective of scientists, and people spread that that information not knowing that it's essentially misinformation, it's false information. There's a lot of that going around about the vaccine, and so it's just important for us to be on the same page. Those of us that are interested in promoting vaccine confidence need to do some of our homework to figure out what the difference is when we see information, if it's misinformation or if it's true information, because this can be dangerous. Misinformation now spreads extremely fast. Misinformation's always been a problem, but it hasn't been as much of a problem until recently, when things can go viral and spread very quickly, like videos on YouTube or even just posts on social media. And because things can spread so fast, these rumors about the vaccine, it can really undermine a lot of the confidence in the vaccine. And so this is something that we think is very important to be prepared to address in anyone that's interested in promoting vaccine confidence.
And quick follow-up, what role does misinformation play in vaccine confidence? Well,
so misinformation, it's not the only story here. There's a lot of factors that go into someone's beliefs and behaviors and whether or not they're ultimately going to get the vaccine. It has a lot to do with kind of what's being talked about in the communities that they belong to, the friends that they have, the groups that they're part of on Facebook, even things that that we're doing on a day-to-day basis. What are people at our church talking about, our family, and also just your individual feelings, because it's obviously something that's going to be going into you. Everyone has different feelings about risks that they're willing to take and what makes them feel safe. Misinformation doesn't play, it's not the main determinant of why someone's going to get a vaccine or not get a vaccine, but it plays a significant role. And so it's important, if misinformation is spreading in some of these communities, to be able to kind of have a lot of conversations among community members, to be able to address any concerns about the vaccine in the places where some of the false information might be circulating.
And just how quickly can some of this misinformation spread, especially now in the age of social media and everything?
It can spread very quickly. We've seen some things, for example, some rumors about how masks don't work. There was a rumor going around about this in October, and it was being spread on social media and through different prominent political individuals. And we could see in a matter of sometimes 48 hours from the time that something is posted online until it's reaching millions and millions of people. So it really can be very concerning just how fast some of these rumors can spread.
And when is it appropriate to just give the information or facts?
Well, so this is a key point, because misinformation is circulating out there, it's not necessarily always prudent to be giving facts when someone says something that isn't true. Facts can be really helpful, but that's not necessarily always what's going to change someone's mind. Someone might come up to you, or you might just be having a conversation about the vaccine, and they might say something that's not true. But trying to dislodge that information that's not true, it doesn't necessarily work if you just say, oh, well, that's wrong, and present someone with a fact that corrects that information. A lot of times, if you're known in your community as someone who knows a lot about the vaccine, if you're a public health champion and people are coming to you to ask questions, it's very likely that they're going to be coming to you with questions that just need facts. And so that's, we definitely promote using facts when appropriate to help provide people with the correct information that they can use to make their own decision about a vaccine. But misinformation is a lot of times more complicated than just showing someone some facts or some data, because usually there's other things. There's peer pressure, there's psychological and social factors, the community that they're getting their information from, that makes it hard for people to let go of some of these beliefs. So we find it appropriate to give facts when someone is essentially making it very clear that that's what they're looking for. And sometimes, in the work that I do, I directly ask, oh, are you looking for facts or information to confirm that that's what someone's looking for, rather than maybe they're just kind of asking a question to see my feelings about the vaccine, for example. And so, for people that are interested in promoting vaccine confidence, the first step is making sure that you have the correct facts. And so, we get our information from reputable sources. A lot of people turn to very good web pages online, and we'll put these web pages in the chat. There's Mayo Clinic has fantastic resources about the coronavirus and the coronavirus vaccine. There's a wonderful website called Dear Pandemic, which is a great place that people essentially write in with questions, and a group of scientist volunteers have created essentially a database of questions about the virus and the vaccine. And of course, we always go to official sources as well. The Centers for Disease Control is a fantastic resource about the vaccine. But more than just providing facts, it's the approach. It's important not to be condescending. It's important to be listening and provide the information that people are asking for, and not just to overwhelm people with lots of data or facts. Because, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is really address people's underlying concerns.
Seems like having that kind of personal connection can make a huge difference, instead of just, throwing those facts out there, connecting with someone on a personal level.
Absolutely.
And Dr. Gorman will get you a little bit in the conversation here. So my question to you is, what are some of the underlying concerns here?
Well, thank you. Yes. One of the things that we've been trying to do, along with our colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania, is put the misinformation into categories, which makes it easier for us to come up with responses. And these things that people are concerned about range from things that are perfectly understandable, and those are the majority of the concerns, to some that are a little bit out there. And I'll just mention a couple of those later. But certainly understandable, first of all, is concerns about safety. So the by far largest category of concerns about vaccines for COVID-19, for example, is, are they safe? Because people recognize that these vaccines were developed very quickly. It used to take up to 10 years to develop a vaccine, and because of incredible progress in medicine and biotechnology, and because the government put so much money into this, we were able to develop safe and effective vaccines for COVID-19 much more quickly than ever before. But you can understand how this would raise concerns in people's minds. And also the first two that were developed for use in this country use a very novel platform, the so-called mRNA platform. And people have never heard of that before. So again, understandably, people have questions about what does that mean to give RNA to somebody? Will it affect my genes and things like that? So that's one important category. There are actually people who doubt the need for the vaccine at all. People who minimize the severity of the illness. Now, we see almost every day in some media source or other the huge number of people who have died from COVID-19 and the tragedy that we're approaching 500,000 Americans, and that's just in this country, who have died. But the actual rate of dying among people who have COVID-19 is quite low. So the vast majority of people who get it survive. And most people, therefore, who know people who have had COVID-19 know people who have survived, and therefore think, well, we don't really need this vaccine because it's better just to get it and get it over with. And so we have to, again, come back to that explanation of why we think it's absolutely critical to have a vaccine and get the vaccine, and why everybody should get it. Another key problem is trust. So we've seen a diminution in trust in the government over the last 4 years. People don't trust the CDC and the FDA as much as they once did. But there's all kinds of other types of mistrust as well. People have some mistrust in the pharmaceutical industry and say, well, they're just making that vaccine to make money. And people understandably have a lot of mistrust of what the government says, because the government, particularly when it comes to people of color, has really done some terrible things in the research field in the past, like Tuskegee and many things like that. So people hear those things, know about those things, and wonder, Are we just being made into guinea pigs? Is this vaccine really a good thing? And that's led, unfortunately, to the paradox that the pandemic is especially severe in communities of color, and those are the people who are most likely to be hesitant about having the vaccine. So that leads to our having to confront that understandable source of misinformation quite a lot. I would say that another one is people get confused when they hear things like the vaccine is 95% effective. And they wonder, well, does that mean it doesn't work 5% of the time? Or what does it exactly mean? So people question how effective it is. And finally, there are people who have ideas that there are alternatives. You don't need the vaccine because you could do other things. Vitamin D is one example that's kind of driving us crazy right now, because there are even some doctors out there who are saying all you need to do is take vitamin D and you can't get COVID-19, which isn't true. And there are people who think that there's something called natural immunity, and they throw around these terms like herd immunity and things like that to imply that if everybody just lets themselves get infected, then eventually the virus will go away. We know that's also not true, and if we did that, we'd lose even more than the 500,000 people that we've already lost. But that's another one of those sources of misinformation that people seem to have bought into.
And I'm sure you've heard everything under the sun, Dr. Gorman.
You got it. You got it.
So to follow up on a point you made, how do we break down those barriers and reach out to those minority communities and some of those other communities who may be hesitant or who may have kind of a preconceived notion of, the medical industry and the government as a whole?
Yeah, Nick, it's a great question, because in a lot of the work that I've done in the Middle East with Syrian and Palestinian refugee communities, you can imagine that there's a certain amount of wariness and sometimes a little bit of distrust of Americans that might be coming in and having discussions about things that are very personal, like health. And so it's one of the most important things, as Dr. Gorman mentioned, is trust. And so, if we're coming in as outsiders into a community, it's making sure that we spend the time to build the trust that's necessary, or sometimes sharing an identity with the community already. And so people that are members of minority communities or live in minority communities who already have a foundation of trust in those communities, that's often the most important place to start. But in all situations, whether you're an outsider kind of talking with communities or you're an insider, always the most important thing is starting from a place of respect and listening to what the underlying concerns are, and a lot of the concerns that Dr. Gorman mentioned.
And just a quick follow-up, I'm wondering if either you could speak to kind of some of the inequalities of scheduling ability or lack thereof.
Yes, so there's still a lag very much in terms of a lot of people from minority communities are not being vaccinated at the rate of people from white communities. So, this is challenging because there represents a number of different disparities. So as you mentioned, Nick, there's very much a disparity in being able to get the vaccine scheduled, to be able to get to the locations where the vaccine is being given out. And in New York, there's starting to be some strides made in this front by providing some mass vaccination sites here in New York City, but as well just starting to really step up the outreach efforts. One of the challenges to the vaccine distribution is a lot of the money for this process. Even though the vaccine came out essentially in December, the federal money wasn't dispersed until kind of the early part of 2021. So we're essentially playing catch up. We as in public health officials are playing catch up to try to get the vaccine to the communities that are most at risk for COVID. And secondly, even before the vaccine was released, there was a lot of vaccine hesitancy in all groups, because I think there were a lot of concerns. One of the things that we've seen as the vaccine has come out, and people are starting to have more and more experience either personally with the vaccine, or their friends and family, or someone that they know has gotten vaccinated and has done fine, that some of that vaccine hesitancy and the concerns are starting to melt away. A lot of people were taking a wait and see approach, and that's starting to melt away. But that said, just a month ago, the Kaiser Family Foundation, they did a survey, and it shows that there's still a disparity in terms of what percentage of people are willing to accept a vaccine. And so in white communities, for example, there's about 28% of people who say that they're pretty hesitant to accept a vaccine, and about half of those wouldn't accept a vaccine at all. And it's similar in Hispanic communities. And unfortunately, in Black communities, it's even worse than that. It's actually close to almost 40%. About 37% say that they're very hesitant to take a vaccine, and about half of those are resistant to taking a vaccine under any circumstances. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done on both of these fronts in terms of trying to help rectify some of these racial disparities between these different communities.
And as more and more people get vaccinated, are you hopeful that some of those numbers will slowly tick down?
Yes. I mean, I think we are starting to see a trend that as more and more people get vaccinated, the people who are taking the wait and see approach, I think, are starting to come into the vaccine camp. And I think there's starting to be more efforts like this one to build vaccine confidence and have respectful discussions about concerns about the vaccine, to start to get the movable middle, all the people that, were concerned and have raising legitimate questions, and starting to be able to answer those questions and help people get vaccinated for those that want it. I think there's still a small minority of people who are going to be very hesitant, very resistant, and I think that's going to be a challenge. That's going to be a challenge for vaccine ambassadors, for public health champions, and so I think we have a lot of work ahead of us to try to get even that small minority, to get them a vaccine in their arms.
And, how do we really listen to some of these underlying concerns that folks might have when it comes to getting the vaccine?
Well, as Dr. Scales has already noted, it's usually not enough just to hear the fact that may be incorrect and to try to provide correct information. You have to do something in addition to that and beyond that. And we try to teach people to put themselves in the shoes of someone who is espousing an incorrect thought about the vaccine or a concern. Because, as I said before, most of this misinformation is wrong, but understandable. So put yourself in the shoes of someone who can see that the vaccine was developed very quickly and is therefore understandably nervous, and acknowledge the fact that that's an understandable concern and understandable fear. So we try to empathize, is the most important thing, with the people who are espousing incorrect information, and we try to meet them where they are. And we use a technique called motivational interviewing, which was actually developed a long time ago, first to try to help change behavior of people who had drug addiction problems, and has now proven to be very successful in changing behavior in a whole bunch of different medical settings and for different medical problems. And we're really trying to change a behavior here from I'm not getting the vaccine to I get the vaccine. And we learned from motivational interviewing several principles, one of which is to empathize, another of which is to encourage a feeling of self-efficacy. So you see already that Dr. Scales is going to put into the chat references, links that people can look up themselves. And we encourage people to go to those links and read reliable information and feel secure that they themselves can come to correct conclusions and can read what the research is all about. So that's extremely important. And we try to make a connection with the people that we're working with. So we often use personal narratives. I fortunately have had the vaccine myself now, and so I point that out to people that I personally have had it and had no adverse reaction whatsoever to it, which is the case for the overwhelming majority of people who have been vaccinated. Number of adverse reactions is minuscule compared to the number of people who have had the vaccine as a whole. So we try to empathize, build self-efficacy, put ourselves in the people's shoes, establish a connection, and understand that all of these things are equally important as providing correct information.
And, for folks out there who, have gotten vaccinated, what are some, arguments they might find from people who are, hesitant, or what tools can we provide them to say, hey, if you do run into this situation, here's the tools you can use?
Well, Nick, so that's a really good question, because I think we we tend to run into that a lot. So there's a couple of different techniques that different people can use. One, some of the best evidence that's out there is using what Dr. Gorman mentioned, motivational interviewing, kind of starting from a point of empathy, promoting self-efficacy. That's really one of the most important ones. And I do urge people to follow some of the links and read more about motivational interviewing, because this is it's a very respectful and a very important way to consider how to give respectful information about the vaccine and build vaccine confidence. There's some other ways, when these things are studied in a lot of social science studies by psychologists, by other types of scientists. And I think Dr. Gorman mentioned a number of them. Providing personal narratives and stories, these can be very compelling. As people that you know and you trust have gotten the vaccine and have done well, that's often something that can be very, both inspiring and it's very familiar to people, and that helps build trust. Appealing to sources trusted by the communities that we're working with. This is very important. In certain communities, so, I work in health, and so when I'm talking to colleagues, we often refer to the Centers for Disease Control, the FDA. These places are very well respected as the people, the scientists that are doing the best science. But as Dr. Gorman mentioned, there's a lot of distrust in science right now and a lot of distrust in the government. And so depending on the communities that you're working with, those might not be the best sources. So understanding your community well enough to know what sources are both correct and authoritative and bring a lot of the science to bear on the question, as well as being trusted in the communities that you're working with is extremely important. There's also things that you can do to help prepare people. For example, if you're aware that there's some rumors and some misinformation that's circulating, you can warn people. You can say, you might hear a little something about how people are dying because of the vaccine, but I just want to let you know, I've looked at all of the information, I've contacted all of these trusted sources that we all trust, and right now there is no data to suggest that that's the case. You might hear that, but I want to warn you that that's not true. So, that type of warning to give people a little bit of information so that if they do ultimately see the rumor and the untruth sometime later, that they're prepared and they know they've already heard from you something that's very trusted, coming from trusted sources. That's very important. So these are all different types of strategies that people can use. And in any one specific instance, there's not an easy way to predict which one's going to be the most effective. So it's important for a vaccine ambassador or a public health champion to be familiar with these different types of techniques, to be able to use them in ways that are organic and that the people they're working with are going to be most responsive to.
And actually, interesting question from CJ, who just sent us a question. His question is, what can corporations do to promote vaccine confidence for some of their employees who, are trying to get vaccinated and come back to work?
I think that corporations play a big role in this. And again, since the majority of people want to have the vaccine, merely making it available or encouraging people will be very important. But I think that corporations can be helpful in doing two things. One is spreading information about the vaccine, spreading accurate information about the vaccine to their employees, and having people who are involved in employee health talk to people who work there. Find out if anybody has any concerns and speak to the people, the individuals who have concerns. So make it a one-on-one thing. There are companies that are doing this where they're actually giving a vaccine one person at a time, talking to the person at a time. The more you can do that kind of thing, the more you reassure people and make them feel like they're part of something rather than something being done to them.
And quick follow-up, Dr. Gorman, how do we identify potentially, fake experts and what kind of their motivations might be behind that?
Right. So, fake experts have a bunch of things in common that sort of highlight them and can call into attention. One thing is they always present themselves as being alone the lone warrior who has information that no one else has. And vitamin D is an example, for instance, where there are a couple of people saying, if you take vitamin D, you'll cure COVID, you won't get COVID. I know this, and no one else in the medical field believes me or is willing to say this because they all just want to promote vaccines. That's a definite red flag when somebody says, I'm the only one who knows it, or the other people have an ulterior motive, because it's almost never true. A second thing that the fake experts do is they give what we call non-falsifiable arguments. And they do this by cherry picking, by picking a study here and a study there, and putting together an argument that you can't argue against because they have chosen things from all these different places to put together an argument. You have to step back and say, gosh, but the main source of information, the vast majority of experts are saying one thing, and this person has found a study here and a study there to put together this story that I can't even argue against because they've concocted it. Usually consensus in science is correct. We can get into the fact that there have been times in the past when that's not the case, but usually when the vast majority of experts agree on something, that's usually the correct path to take. And the fake expert is usually the outlier who is not going by the evidence. So it actually is interesting, I just mentioned quickly again with vitamin D, that there are studies ongoing because there may be something to the story about vitamin D playing a role in COVID-19. But as of right now, as of today, there is no actual rigorous trial that's shown that vitamin D is very helpful, and there are a couple of that show it's not. So it's a very good example of how a fake expert will ignore that mainstream fact and cherry pick from the fringes to try to put together an argument. And we have to be very wary of that.
And what are some of the techniques to address hesitancy when, someone doesn't counter it?
So Nick, do you mean like when someone's not countering, there's some rumor or some untruth that's circulating, but no one's really pushing against it?
Yes.
Yeah. So one of these things that I would say is very important to recognize what context you're in, because there's a couple of different contexts that might be really important. If you're with your community, say you're at a church gathering, this might be a time to have a very respectful discussion among a lot of people who might have similar concerns. If you're at work, it might be something similar to that, where it might be people are asking genuine questions and raising a bit of misinformation, something that's not true just because they heard this. And that might be an effective place where giving some facts could be really helpful. But you also might find that this could be an entry point. There might be times where someone is a bit of a hardline, has hardline beliefs that are very much against vaccines and vaccination in general. So there's times where it can be really helpful to engage, right? Especially kind of communities that are interested, that are trying to gather facts, that are trying to understand the situation to make better decisions for themselves. But it's very important to recognize if you might be in a situation where someone is essentially trying to spread disinformation, where someone is really trying to undermine confidence in a vaccine. If people have their own personal view of a vaccine, that's fine, but if someone is really actively trying to spread rumors that are known to be not true, then sometimes it's not necessarily the best idea to try to engage people like that in public. It's the kind of thing that, in private, you can have, personal discussions if you're a trusted friend or relative of that person and try to understand kind of where they're coming from. But in public, it often tends to be a little bit of almost like a kind of political acrimonious discussion. We don't necessarily recommend engaging in that type of situation. So Nick, so if you are someone who's observing this type of misinformation, the first step almost is the self-awareness of what kind of situation is it? Is this a situation that's worth engaging in? And if so, absolutely, engage with facts, engage using some of the techniques that Dr. Gorman mentioned. But if this does not seem like a productive moment to engage, and it just feels like this is a rumor monger who's spreading lots of disinformation, I think it's completely appropriate to mention that and just say, I think this is not a conversation that is is really beneficial for everybody. I think we should step back from it.
And a question we actually just got in from EK. They're asking, please discuss whether you believe that individuals should have a choice of which vaccine they receive and why you feel that way.
I would say that for right now, of course, we favor everybody having choice, but there's no evidence that it makes a difference. In other words, there's really no evidence that the Pfizer versus Moderna, which are the two vaccines that are available today, that one is better than the other. So I would tell somebody, don't hold out for one when you can get the other one. Get whatever vaccine you can get. People are having enough trouble in some places getting any vaccine, so get the one that you can get, because it probably doesn't make any difference either way. And I think that'll be true as these new vaccines hopefully come online, as more vaccines come online. It'll really be advisable to get the one you can get.
And I think that's an interesting point that you made, Dr. Gorman, is that, you can get either or vaccines. You shouldn't be, you shouldn't be particular in which vaccine you get. So we also actually just got another question from CARE. I know we had the science discussion last week, but Carl wants to know if you had COVID-19 and you survived it, do you need to then get the vaccine?
So right now, the public health recommendations are yes, and I definitely recommend the talk from last week about becoming a COVID-19 vaccine ambassador had a lot of excellent discussion about a lot of the science behind the vaccines and answered a lot of these questions. So I highly recommend that talk by Dr. Morales and her colleagues. But in this specific instance, right now, that is the recommendations of the public health community. The recommendation, the reason for that recommendation is there is some evidence to suggest that immunity to COVID-19 might decline over time. Now, we're still trying to understand how long that immunity might last, how long it takes to decline, both if for someone who was infected and for someone who got the vaccine. So, as these questions are still being essentially sorted out by scientists, because the science is still uncertain. So while the science is uncertain, the public health recommendation is to err on the safe side, which is to, even if you've had COVID, to get the vaccine.
And actually a perfect follow-up is, how do we address the fact that the science is uncertain?
Well, that's, again, a wonderful question, because we have to deal with that with science in general for so many things. And we really have to start educating people a little bit more about how science works. Good example is with face masks, for example. You may remember that way back at the beginning of the pandemic, even the trusted, beloved Dr. Fauci said, I don't want to see everybody running around with face masks. And then later on, he has become, as he should be, a strong advocate of everybody wearing face masks. And some people have said, well, he changed his mind. How do they know what's really true? How do I know what's really true? What happened there was really that we learned more about how the virus is transmitted. And we also had some more data on how masks work. But originally, we thought the virus was just transmitted by heavy droplets, for which masks are not as effective. And then we learned that they're also aerosolized and spread throughout the air, for which masks are more effective. And that led to a change in the recommendation about how frequently to use face masks. And so we have to reassure people that most of the time when science changes its mind, it's because something new has been learned. And for anyone to claim otherwise is, again, undermining the process of science. You'll again see people who will say they changed their mind so they don't know anything. It's definitely not true. They've changed their mind because they've learned something new. And that's how we have to address that problem.
I think that's an important point that you just brought up with folks out there who might be concerned, is that it does seem like, especially with the science and everything is so fluid, and opinions can change as more facts come in.
Right. That's absolutely true.
Actually, Tara also had a follow-up as well. She said, what about women who are in their childbearing years. What kind of studies are out there as far as, the research on that topic?
So research, so a couple things to know about this. So in the original studies, women who were pregnant were omitted from those studies. That's because pregnant women are a special category that require extra special cautions to be engaged in research. There were some women in those studies who did get pregnant during the course of those studies. There's also kind of a lot of work being done now by scientists to try to understand, the situation with respect to women of childbearing age and who are interested in getting pregnant who are pregnant and the vaccine. And while the data is not certain, again, science is uncertain, there is a lot of consensus. And so there's a group called ACOG, which is it's the American College of Gynecologists. So this is a specialist community who are the specialists when it comes to pregnant women, and they are actually recommending the vaccine. So it's, in the situation where science is uncertain, I think we're going to get a lot more information as we go forward about the exact risks and benefits. But they generally say, ACOG believes that the risks of COVID for pregnant women are pretty high, and the risks of the vaccine are pretty low. And so on that risk-benefit balance, they're suggesting the vaccine, and that makes a lot of sense. And so I think it's always important for someone to talk to their doctor to figure out if it's right for them, because there's always a lot of factors involved in this. But right now, as a general public health recommendation, that's the recommendation for now until the science becomes more certain.
And I know we touched on it a little earlier in our conversation here, but Nicole asked, how can we encourage communities who have legit historical trauma caused by the medical community to trust that the vaccine is safe, specifically when we're, of course, talking about minority communities and communities of color?
Yeah, so Nick, I think that's an excellent question, because I think this is where the rubber is going to meet the road, because hopefully we're going to get to a point where all the people who want to vaccinate, who want a vaccine, have gotten one. And then there's going to be the group of people who are a little bit more hesitant, where it's going to take a lot more effort to really help them understand and address their concerns. And so the suggestion that I have is, again, so number one is the most important thing is trust. If you're from those communities and you have a foundation of trust in those communities, that's something that can be really important. And if you are new to those communities, it's important to gain trust before starting to try to tell people what to do. It's important to listen and understand the concerns. But one of the most important things I would say is don't give up. Keep the conversation going. Because as long as this conversation continues to go around to people are being respectful of each other in these discussions, then a lot of the hesitancy and resistance does begin to melt away. And I'll give one example. So in the Washington Post today, there was an article about a woman. This is a Black woman who lives in a place called Belle Glade, Florida. Her name is Tammy Jackson Moore. So, Miss Jackson Moore, she, is a community that is about 60% Black. And she is part of this volunteer group called Guardians of the Glade. And so she and a bunch of other members of this group have actually been going around the town, essentially knocking on doors, talking to people that they see. I mean, she's lived in this town for 30 years. She either knows everybody in the town or if she's talking to you, she knows somebody who knows you. So by doing this, she's not trying to convince you. She's essentially rolling with the resistance. If someone says that they're not interested, she says, she's very respectful. She says, let's keep talking about it. We'll come back. And she starts talking about their other family members to find out if their other family members are getting vaccinated. So she's got the trust of her community, and she's using that to just remind people of how important it is to get vaccinated. And she's continuing the conversation as she continues to go around the community. And so I think that's one of the most effective ways for people to be public health champions and vaccine ambassadors in their community. And I think that's really the way that we're going to be able to get over the line and get as close as we can to herd immunity.
And, how major is that to be able to have, that friendly face out there that, a person who might be hesitant can connect to.
Very, I'll give you another example of how important that is. There was a real problem a few years back with anti-vaccination organizations working to try to convince Somalian citizens in Minnesota to not have the measles vaccine. And they suddenly saw this huge drop of measles vaccinations in that community. And they called in all kinds of experts, and it was proving very difficult to change the tide of that until somebody said, this is a largely Muslim community. Let's educate the imams in this community and about the vaccine and vaccine safety. Let's ask them to talk to the people. And lo and behold, vaccine rates went back up to nearly 100%. So critically important to identify trusted sources within specific communities and make sure that they're the ones who are talking to the people.
And when do we know when to, not engage or when to disengage when the conversation may get out of hand or anything?
So I think that this is critical because there are certain times where, especially in a public type of setting, someone might be talking about a rumor that's just that the reason they're doing it is not because they're trying to raise vaccine awareness, but they're really trying to undermine confidence in the vaccine. So, online, sometimes people that are doing this are sometimes called trolls. And, in person, these are people who just might not be engaging in good faith. So the challenge with this is engaging in someone who's very publicly trying to spread rumors about the vaccine, and just generally trying to undermine vaccine confidence. This is the type of thing where it's often not a good idea to engage in public. It's often a better idea to find out if someone's concerns are genuine and try to engage them in a more private conversation. Because if their concerns are genuine, that's absolutely something that we should be, discussing with them, understanding, providing any information, resources, or in active listening as much as possible to help them come to the understanding that they need to come to about the vaccine, as well as understanding where the differences are. Because are they pulling misinformation from untrusted sources? Are they listening to fake experts? And so just having a little bit of a discussion of where someone might be getting some of their information, but all of that can and should be done privately if it feels like someone's really not trying to engage in good faith.
And EK asks if you both could discuss the virus's current and future variants, mutations in light of urgent recommendations for the present vaccine.
Well, we always worry about mutations in viruses. That's one of the things that has made it so difficult, for example, to develop vaccines for HIV, and why we seem to have to give vaccines every year for different strains of flu. The one good piece of news about the COVID-19, the virus that causes COVID-19, is that it seems to be a virus that mutates very slowly, much more slowly than the flu virus. So it's not going to develop new strains at the rate that the flu does. But we do know that there's always going to be pressure on the virus to mutate, to elude the immune system, including vaccine-induced immunity. And there is some evidence that some of the vaccines that we already have are a little less effective against some of the new strains than they are against the original strain. Overall, I think it's reasonable to say that regardless of what strain, that the vaccines are effective, that we need to constantly surveil that situation. So we trust the CDC and other authorities to constantly be sequencing the genome of the virus to see what develops. And we also see that the pharmaceutical companies that make these vaccines are already in the process of designing booster shots or ways of handling the new strains. So in multiple different ways we'll be protected. I would predict that right now that there's going to be a lot of talk soon about whether there needs to be a shot again in a year or so. And we just don't have that information yet. We don't know exactly how long immunity lasts, and we don't know whether the new strains will become sufficiently different from the current ones that a new booster shot will be needed. If we need it, we'll have to get it. But I think the important thing is that we're watching out for that very, very carefully.
And when it comes to those healthcare professionals or those healthcare advocates in some of those minority communities, what do you feel is the best tool that they can use in their arsenal to kind of break down some of these barriers?
I think, Nick, I keep coming back to the importance of trust, because if it's a certain self-assessment of, do you have the trust of that person? And if you have the trust of that person, that's a great place to start. Talking about your own personal journey, if you've gotten the vaccine or you have friends or family that got the vaccine, and not just the fact that you got it, but your decision-making process, because we are often not just automatically getting a vaccine. We all went through a decision-making process to say, where did we get our information? What information did we find most useful to help us make that decision? But also in that self-assessment of trust, it's if you aren't the person that this person seems to trust most, kind of almost having a discussion about that and finding out who do they trust and where they get their information, because sometimes that can be one of the important sources to being able to reach them most effectively. Sometimes that might be a family member or other friends. Maybe they get their information from elsewhere. Sometimes it's even, communities abroad. If people, we all have extended families in different places. And so sometimes people are getting their information from extended families that are even outside the United States. And so it's very important to kind of understand, listening actively to where people are kind of getting some of their information, where their concerns are being raised, and leveraging that trust as much as possible, whether that's personal trust or trust in other very respected people that they might look up to and what they're saying about the vaccine. Using some of our own personal narratives to be able to talk about, what worked for us. And then in certain situations, as Dr. Gorman mentioned, there are times where employing motivational interviewing could be very helpful, just to help build someone's self-efficacy that, that they can take the steps necessary to really get to the point that they feel comfortable getting a vaccine.
And, obviously trust is very, very difficult to, build and everything like that. But if there was kind of that first step or that first leap into building that trust, what do you think that first step would be?
I think it comes down to listening. So in the work that I do in the Middle East, when I'm working with refugees, even though I have a background in medicine, I have a background in sociology, I come in with a lot of experience. But what I don't have is I don't have knowledge and experience in the community itself. And so the first thing I do when I go into the community is I listen. I ask questions, and I really try to listen a lot. I show respect. And so by respectfully listening and really trying to understand what the community hears and what they know, that's often the most important place. That's where I start.
And we got about 5 minutes left. So I just wanted to see if there were any last comments or anything that you both wanted our audience out there to know moving forward as they think about, getting vaccinated and getting the vaccine and some of the tools that they can take with them into their own communities.
One of the things that we have the most trouble with in science and medicine is to help people understand relative risk. And it's very important here because everybody is going to see headlines in the newspaper every time somebody somewhere develops something after they've had the vaccine. And because that's what makes headlines, right? It's the exception. And that's then going to trigger people to say, oh my goodness, maybe I shouldn't have it. So we try to remind people that I think we're close to 50 million people have had the vaccine now, right? And the actual rate of any adverse effect from the virus, from the vaccine, is tiny compared to the risk of getting sick with COVID-19. So those numbers are sometimes so huge that it's hard for people to appreciate. But when I think about them, I personally feel very reassured that the risk of the vaccine is very, very tiny compared to anybody's risk of getting COVID-19. And getting COVID-19 is really bad, as Dave, who's taken care of many, many patients with COVID-19, knows. So that's, one of the things that we definitely want to leave people with, to consider those kinds of risks and balances.
And I would just add to that, the recognition that in this work that we're doing, trying to build vaccine confidence, that it's not just a simple matter of distributing facts, because facts aren't going to go anywhere unless there's trust. And so what we really need to do is build that trust. And then I think then people can hear the facts and they can understand the facts. And so I think I think those two pieces are critical as we think about trying to build vaccine confidence.
And I guess just lastly, are you both, optimistic moving ahead into the future that, we'll be able to reach out to some of these communities who might feel concerned about getting the vaccine?
I definitely am. I mean, I think that we're seeing a lot of attention being paid to how people feel about things, much more than ever before. And as David said, as Dr. Scale said, you have to really listen to people and understand. And I think this is one of the first times that I can recall where that's a real topic of conversation. And where people really are stopping and saying, it's not just this miraculous science that developed the vaccine that we have to think about. We also have to think about the fact that people have feelings about vaccines and feelings about medication, and feelings about the way the healthcare system work, and we have to understand those and address them. And so because I think that we're starting to do that for the first time, and that this situation with COVID has forced us to do that, that gives me optimism that we're going to develop the methods and the tools of better understanding and better helping people to come to good decisions about their health.
Yeah, and Nick, I would just echo that, because it's, I think, the public health community has gotten on the ball late. I think did a fantastic job of developing the vaccine as quickly as possible, but didn't have as much resources as necessary to really kind of get the jump on trying to get the vaccines to the people that need it most as quickly as possible. So I think they're catching up. And so what I'm really hopeful, both in the short term, that this is really, there's going to be a catch up in getting the vaccine where it's needed. But I'm also hopeful that some of the discussions that we're having about these disparities, about systemic racism, that I hope some of this leads to a certain amount of health equity, even after, hopefully, when things get back to normal, that we we take some of the lessons from this, and things don't go completely back to normal in terms of a lot of the inequities that we've seen kind of leading up to this point.
Normal would certainly be nice. I love hearing some words of optimism from both you doctors. I appreciate it. I appreciate the audience for joining us. I appreciate the questions. I appreciate the conversation. Again, this is being recorded and will be at the same URL immediately following. So if there was anything you missed or anything like that, please feel free to hop on the link at your URL at your leisure. Thank you guys so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.